Today we're going to be talking about making the transition, making the leap from Maya to Unreal. And I know a lot of animators I've talked to have found that to be maybe an intimidating idea because animating in a game engine can sound a little weird. Uh, I've been working in commercials, games, film, short films, YouTube stuff all over the place for about the last 15 years. And when the initial, oh, sorry, getting ahead of myself. We're going to talk about my first experience using Unreal to animate and why you would want to, because you can animate in Maya. It's worked just fine for years. We're going to talk about some of the similarities, the differences, limitations you might run into, and what you can do to get around some of those, as well as some final thoughts. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. Okay, so my first exposure to animating in Unreal was a couple years ago before Unreal 5 was even out. Aaron Sims Creative had hired me to do some kind of giant robot animation in Unreal. And at the time they're like, yeah, it's going to be in Unreal Engine 5, some new tools, yada, yada. And it wasn't immediately apparent that they actually wanted the animation to, at least in part, be done in the engine itself. And I didn't think much of it at the time. And so they had a temp rig. I started blocking stuff out in Maya, and that turned out to be a great preparation for this because I ended up then doing the exact same animation later on in Unreal. But at the time, the only expectation was that they wanted at least maybe part of a shot done in Unreal because the tools were untested and they didn't want to commit to just saying, yeah, we're going to do this whole thing in Unreal if it wasn't viable. And nobody really knew yet because we were laying down the tracks, we're driving the train over it. And so the demo, as if you recognize this guy, ended up being that second Unreal Engine 5 Valley of the Ancients demo. And as you can see, the play blast I did here ended up being fairly close to what I did in Unreal, which should tell you something about what's possible. And so once the control rig was ready, we hit the ground running, and it was honestly a really impressive effort for the timeline and the number of people involved that it really came together in a relatively short amount of time, especially since half the tools we were using were still in development, still new. And while the tool set that was used in this was more limited, especially at the time, than what I had available to me in Maya, I was surprised that I didn't run into anything that was just a dead stop, like I had to tell them I just can't animate this. And it worked well enough that it very quickly shifted from can we do a shot to let's just do the whole thing. Let's just animate every bit of this guy in Unreal, straight in engine. And that's what ended up happening. And what I learned from that experience was that in spite of the more limited tool set compared to Unreal, there was actually something special about the experience of animating in the scene. It was, I don't know, I had just never experienced anything like it. You get used to working in Maya with proxy meshes, whatever, and it was just a really cool experience. And I really enjoyed animating in a game engine, which I would not have thought possible. I'm the kind of animator that if I see a job takes, 3D Max, I'm like, I'm probably just going to say no because I don't feel like dealing with that. I'm comfortable with Maya. My friends tell me I need to learn Blender, and I'm like, those tools look super cool, but it's always just that leap of learning a new piece of software, putting the time into it, having the motivation. And so this was a great excuse where I was forced to learn something new, very, very new, which kind of made it less intimidating because there was no expectations because nobody knew if it was quite going to work. All right. So that brings us to, which I've touched on a little, why bother working in Unreal when Maya does work fine? Been using it for years. Most of my career has been in Maya, and it works great. I can get the animations into Unreal. Why bother? For me, it comes down to a few things that seem small that end up being a lot bigger. First up is just context. In Unreal, I can see what I'm animating in, and not just see like some gray boxes or proxy meshes even, I can animate on some very high quality stuff, like the actual geometry that's probably going to be rendered in the shot or shown off in the game. Obviously, as games and stuff being developed, you always have temp stuff, but nevertheless, you're seeing what everybody else is seeing, and that's great. And along with that is also just the lighting. Lighting can make such a big difference to how a pose comes across. I've had so many times where I would think a shot looked great, and then I see it lit, and I'm like, oh, that doesn't read at all. I can't see it with the silhouette or with the angle here that highlights this thing I didn't want shown. And so being able to see it with, again, even if it's not the final lighting, to have lighting in the scene that's whatever is current to what's being worked on is hugely powerful. Also, just having a shared space. In Valley of the Ancients, I could see the mound around the ancient changing, the rock shifting here and there, and they could see my animation as it progressed, and there was no disconnect there. It felt a lot more collaborative in the sense that everybody was on the same page, and that was really great. With something like this guy crawling across here, since I have what I know is the the final geometry, I can make adjustments. I can take my loop and, tweak it to the geometry, the surface he's crawling on and stuff like that. And then finally, just speed. Unreal Engine, I mean, clearly you can crank it to bring any computer to tears, but it runs really fast. The control rigs run really fast. And I I animated the entirety of the Valley of the Ancients robot shots on a laptop sitting on my couch. And if I recall, I think the rig is like 30 million polys or something like that. Like that, I would not attempt to even open that scene in Maya. It just wouldn't be possible. So sounds like animating in Unreal's all unicorns and rainbows, nothing to worry about. Just, uninstall every other piece of software you've got. Well, it's not quite that. Nothing ever is. I hate to break it to you, but if you're an animator, you're always going to have to accept a certain amount of misery. You just have to make sure you're having fun while you're going through it. And Unreal isn't necessarily going to replace animating. The truth is, there's nothing to stop you from animating an entire short film or a game directly in Unreal. If it's not the future, I'm convinced that it is going to be a big part of it. And I think it's definitely worth having in your toolbox so that when somebody asks you, hey, can you just do this in Unreal? We have the control rigs, you'll be ready. And so without further ado, let's take a look at what you can expect if you're making that transition from Maya to Unreal, and how the tools compare and what you can expect to see. So first and foremost is just rigs. Rigs are rigs. Thankfully, Epic didn't do some wild, crazy new thing. As you can see with this guy, he looks like a rig, maybe a little bit prettier, a little more colorful, but it is what you expect. And when you're moving these guys around, you can expect to use those same WER hotkeys for your translate, rotate, scale. And that's one of the things I really appreciate, is that Epic clearly assumed that animators would be coming from Maya. And so most of the hotkeys, the major ones you use, they just work without you needing to make any kind of custom adjustments. And that's makes it a much smoother transition. Little bonus tip I will insert, though, that I highly recommend you turn on if you're like me. I like to rotate with the rotation ball. I like to rotate from camera, even though in school they told me that was a terrible way to do it. You'd end up with gimbal lock. But you can turn on all those settings if you go into the editor settings, search for rotate or look and feel, check some of these boxes here that you see, and it'll give you a widget more like you probably come to expect in Maya. That brings us to our first tool, pivot tool. And this is one that's +1 in Unreal's camp. Maya, you can hit insert, change your pivot and stuff, but you're kind of permanently changing the pivot for the control, by default. In Unreal, they have a pivot tool much more similar to what you might find in Animbot, where you can, adjust those custom pivots, edit pose, and then always come back to it. And that is super, super handy. Um, Again, that's not, if you're looking at vanilla Maya, that's not really something you have a great equivalent to. I know as animators, we spend a lot of our time in the channel box, probably more time than I'd like, staring at that list of things. All your translate, rotate, whatever rig you may have might have a lot of controls in there. And thankfully, Unreal has more or less the same thing. This particular rig has that ball roll on a control. But when you look in the anim details, which is the equivalent to the channel box, you're going to find a lot of the same things on this particular rig. If you select the main control, you're going to find all your IK control on and offs there. You can key things. It works very much like the channel editor. It's just going to depend on the particular rig you're using. And speaking of IKFK, another plus for Unreal is that since most of the rigs that you're going to find are based on the MetaHuman rig, the IKFK switching they have on there is fantastic. In Maya, you do tend to be at the mercy of whether or not somebody built the tool for your particular rig or using some third-party thing, and you end up with that dreaded pop. But in Unreal, as you can see, as I'm turning it on and off, it's auto-compensating, and that is always fantastic. The less counter animating we have to do, the better. Another thing you're always switching between in Maya that should be no problem in Unreal is your world space, object space. When you're rotating things, translating things, all you have to do is hit the Control tilde key, and you can just switch it that way, or go to the little thing on your menu bar at the top of the window. Again, another one of those tools that I'm constantly using in Maya that I wouldn't know how to live without if they didn't have it in Unreal. The pose library is another one that you don't really have an equivalent to in Unreal. The pose library can do a couple of things. It can save poses, but it can also save selection sets. And while there's no direct, as far as I'm aware, pose library built into Maya as such, you can obviously create selection sets, but then you end up with kind of a messy outliner with all these different selections. And something like Animbot has a much better implementation of that kind of tool if you want to go that route. Unreal has a tool, the pose library, that basically combines both those things. If you create a selection of a whole character, a few things, hand pose or whatever, you can save out a pose. It's going to create a picture so you can recognize it, but then it's also going to let you select whatever you had selected pretty easily. And then to paste that pose, it actually gives you a lot of options for mirroring it, for kind of how you want to balance things out. And that's actually super handy and more than a lot of pose library tools will give you. I do wish that they had some kind of in-between option that would allow you something a little more compact like Animbot has, so that you could see your selections without having to have like a full window open and scroll through the pictures. But again, it's still a far cry better than what you'd get by default in Maya. It works really well. And as a bonus, if you're going to another project, every time you save one of these poses, it's going to save it in a file. So you can always take that with you. If you're using the rig in another place in the project or another project entirely, you don't have to recreate this library every time. The timeline. That's definitely where we spend most of our time. And this is where things do start to get a little bit different. Setting keys is thankfully not one of those places. You grab your rig in Maya, you move it, set a key, hit the S key. Yes, that still works in Unreal. Again, one more hotkey that you don't have to memorize a different key for. Although, as you can see in my example there, I had my knee in a weird place and it does some funny things to the foot. Just like in Maya, you have key settings. You can have it auto key. Same button, different place. And while you can actually do one extra trick in Unreal that Maya doesn't give you, in Maya, you can have it key just the modified attributes or just everything on the control. Unreal adds this fun new one called key group. And basically what that lets you do is one step further than just something like key modified attributes, where if I was moving, say, the X translate, it will key the X, Y, and Z while leaving the scale and rotate alone. So it's kind of nice if you have something you're going through and you just want to be animating rotations and you want it to just key those without having to worry about it either not keying the other rotations or keying the translate and scale. If you don't want to touch those, like, it's actually really nice to be able to go through and know you're just keying what you want and having that more granular control. So another +1 to Unreal on that. Default tangents, that's much the same, although in this case, Maya does have a few more options. That being said, the options that they chose to put in Unreal are the ones that I most frequently use. Some of the auto ones in Maya have gotten pretty good, but again, you do have the basic expected stuff in Unreal, and it works just fine. I haven't had any situations with that where I'm like, man, I really wish I had some particular type of tangent space. And animation flow, probably one of the more important ones. And while the basics of setting keys works much like Maya, the timeline itself is actually quite different, at least by default. I think this is probably the biggest difference that you're going to come across with flow when you get into Unreal from Maya. In Maya, if I grab a control, the keys on the control show up in the timeline. And if I select a bunch of controls, I see all the keys displayed together on the timeline at the top there. Though I won't know which keys I've got selected if I've selected a bunch of controls, because it just stacks them all on top of each other unless I've been keying everything together. Sequencer appears to work that way at first, but as soon as you select a specific control, it's going to take you to what amounts to a separate timeline down the list. And that same information is there, but while Maya makes things much more flattened view of the keys, Unreal uses Sequencer to expand all the timelines for each control in one place. In terms of actual animation workflow, I've gotten used to in Maya. This was the biggest mental hurdle for me personally. You build up an expectation of what happens when you select control, and this is just a bit different. There's some ways you can get things to act a bit more like you expect in Maya, and I'll get to that in a minute. So yeah, as you can see, click on a control in Unreal, and instead of getting some compressed timeline, you get a whole stack. When you have the top of your control rig and you're at the very top control, you'll see all the keys compressed, but as soon as you click something, boom. Here's some of the ways I've adapted to this alternative way of thinking about the timeline. Depending on how you work, this might not be a big deal for you, or it might take a little reworking of how you approach the flow, especially I found when blocking and refining, where I tend to just want simplicity, go through, set my poses, and not think about things too much. It works fine. It just can be a bit cluttered visually when you're just trying to focus on your key poses. On the plus side, you can scroll through your controls and you can see where most of the action is happening just at a glance. There's not really a direct equivalent that even gives you this option in Maya, so that's a plus, but it does take some adjustment. If you create just a selection set for your whole rig as you're blocking, if you're like me and you just like to key everything from the start, and you go through and set your poses, you can just kind of ignore the timeline, and at least for that, it won't really affect you. Because the timelines can get long depending on how complicated the rig gets. So let's do that. Let's take a look at a little bit more complicated rig with more controls than Manny there. This was a creature that I animated for Aaron Sims Creative for a short they did in Unreal called the Iclanthic. And obviously this guy has a whole lot going on. He's got 6 arms, way too many fingers. He's got like little tentacle teeth things. And there's just a lot. And so if you look at his timeline for this animation, there's a lot. But you can also see, like I said, at a glance, you can kind of see where I set like basic pose keys and then where I went in and refined. And so it does give you a lot of useful information, but ultimately it's up to you to decide what is useful. In this case, Unreal is just giving you a lot more information at a glance than Maya does. But you're still ultimately just making poses, setting keys, and there's nothing really going to stop you from that. It's just about how it's visualized. It's just this versus this, same information, just a different view. All right, all that being said, there are a few things you can do to at least try to get Unreal to act a bit more like Maya, although you do have a few compromises in the meantime. So the first step, you can go to your filter settings and you can check the selected control rig controls. And what that does is it will just show you what you have selected. But if you select a bunch of controls, you're going to see a bunch of controls. And so that only really cleans things up if you only have one thing selected. Another thing you can add on to that will compress it even further and really give you the closest you're going to get is to uncheck auto expand nodes on selection. And what that does is it will stop expanding like your control rig there. So you can see the mannequin body. If you click on something, it'll just show you the top and it'll clean up that visual clutter. You will just see the top keys. The downside of that is that you lose out on a lot of the information and ultimately you can't see anything else in your sequencer. So useful if you want to just focus on that, but I would actually recommend trying it the default way in Unreal and see if you can get used to it, get to like it, having that information, and then maybe using those tools in instances where you're just bumping into something that's bothering you too much. And that leads us to the graph editor. This one is thankfully a lot more similar. You're going to have a lot less mental friction on what to learn, what's different. Unfortunately, though, Unreal will not save you from the spaghetti monster. It's a familiar horror. So in Maya, the layout is you've got your outliner on the left with your channels. You can click through them. You've got your view space and then your settings at the top. Unreal is laid out just the same. Outliner on the side, editor space, and toolbar on top. The main difference here is that, as with the timeline and sequencer, you've got all your controls on the left all the time. And obviously you can expand to see the particular channels, but they are there and they are always there. Oh, and also the one other difference, you middle mouse drag in Maya, you right mouse drag in Unreal, but I think we can forgive them that difference. Tangents also work as you'd expect. You've got your auto, your linear, your stepped. You can break your tangents, and then your weighted or non-weighted. Pre and post infinity. This is one that Unreal works much like Maya, but it actually gives you a bonus that I really, really, really like that I wish Maya would steal. All your pre and post infinity settings are the same, nothing at all missing in this one. But as a bonus, when you use it in Unreal, you can actually see on the timeline what's happening, which if you've ever made a walk cycle or something makes it much easier to see the flow. If you're getting a pop, from one loop to the next, it's great for being able to visualize like where that might be happening. Key transform. So Maya gives you some transform options, let you scale keys around. This can be useful when you just want to select a bunch of stuff and adjust it. Unreal has a very similar tool, but it does you one better in that you can actually adjust the pivot of how your scale works, which is a small thing, but it actually makes the tool a lot more powerful. The retime tool is literally identical. If you know how to use it in Maya, it's identical. Great for doing slow-mo, doing speed ramps. You set lines, you set adjustment lines within them, and you're good to go. The filters is one that Maya has a lot more options on for how to filter through your curves. But at the same time, I feel like the ones that Epic chose are certainly the ones that I use the most. Again, it's one of those things where it's like, oh, it'd be nice to have the full list you see there in Maya, but I don't really use the other ones all that much, if at all. You've got Bake, Euler filter. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation, but the Fourier transform, which is great if you want to take out pops and extremes from like mocap data and stuff, and then simplify. And there are options within those. And then there's the outlier tools, ones that Unreal has that Maya doesn't, Maya has that Unreal doesn't. Maya has this lattice tool, which I can't say I've ever actually used, but I feel like if I ever need to turn a walk cycle into a drunk walk cycle, that would be the way to go. And then you have Unreal with this kind of multi-scale tool where it works a lot like the transform, but you can set pivots for the individual channels while you're doing it. So you can end up with some really weird stuff. It's one of those where I haven't found a specific use for it, but at the same time, I'm sure if I hit that moment, I'll be like, oh, that's what it's for. View modes. There are some options that Unreal has that Maya doesn't have any equivalents for. For instance, Unreal's graph editor has some unique view modes. I said earlier, Unreal's curve editor wouldn't save you from the spaghetti monster, but in this case, it kind of does. The default is just the absolute view mode. It's the one you're used to. It works like you'd expect. You got the timeline, you've got everything going up to its whatever value, and you see it overlaid. If you switch to the stacked view mode, you get something a little different. Instead of everything being overlaid on top of each other, we get a stack of every channel having its own little space, which certainly makes things less cluttered, even if you do have to scroll a little. And then everything is normalized to between 1 and -1. So while you're not seeing the true values, it does make it a lot easier if you have a particularly messy bunch of spaghetti that you're trying to sort through, to just see things as they are. And then the last one is the normalized view mode, which does stack everything, but does that normalizing between 1 and -1, which again is useful in that even though you're not seeing the true values of the curves per se, if you have something where one curve is going way up here and these other ones are down here, it helps keep them in space visually a little bit easier. Tween tool. As far as I know, Maya doesn't have one of these built in, although goodness knows there's a gajillion scripts. Unreal's works really well, although it certainly doesn't have the gajillion options that something like Animbot does. But again, it's one of those things where, for the most part, the way I use the tween tool, it does 90% of what I need it to. First up, Unreal has 3 different options for how the tween tool can affect your curves. The blend to neighbor is just the standard. If you set it to 0, it's going to set your key to where it defaulted to, where it started. If you use the PP or push pull, this will push things from one extreme to the other based on the previous and end frame. And then tween, if you set it to 0, it will set your key exactly between the previous and next key. And if you slide it, it's going to push it towards either one of those without going past. The motion trail tool is another nice surprise in Unreal. Maya's is functional. I never use the in-engine one because something like Animbot or other tools, they just function better and faster. Unreal's is surprisingly quick. I feel like even with the best ones that I use in Maya, it just ends up being slow at times, depending on the rig you're using. Unreal's is really, really fast, and it's got some nice visual options for being able to adjust thickness, the visuals on your keys and whatnot. So that's another one that's definitely a win for Unreal over vanilla Maya, at least. So you can adjust thickness. A lot of the things are the same, but man, the one in Unreal is just so fast. Constraints. When Unreal Engine 5 launched, and back when I was animating Valley of the Ancients, I remember afterwards, they're like, is there any like, feature requests or whatever? And I had some things, was like the biggest thing, throw everything else I just said out, just give me constraints, because there was no constraints. And all I could think was somebody's going to ask me to animate someone juggling and I'm going to cry. I mean, if somebody asked me to animate something juggling in Maya, I still cry, but that's a separate issue. It's really hard to do any kind of complex animation in anything without constraints. Like, it's just love-hate relationship, you gotta have them. And I remember as a young animator, that was something really intimidating, trying to sort through, okay, I've got locators, I've got groups and these constraints, but if I want to have this thing let go, it was just, it took me a long time to wrap my head around. And I'm excited for people just starting in and starting out in animation, getting into Unreal, because it's a lot easier, it's a lot simpler. So just quickly, in Maya, you select your parent, you select your child, you set a constraint, and that works fine. That's simple enough. But if I want to toss a ball in the air, I have to jump through some hoops. I can animate the constraint on and off, but I can't actually animate the thing I constrained. And it's not a hard problem to work around. You have to set up, some nested locators or groups that are tied to get the ball. And that locator is probably parented to another locator, and you've actually constrained to the hand. And even once you get it working, you'll still need to do a bunch of counter animating, because when you turn it off, it's going to snap back and pop to its original position, and it's not fun. Unreal's approach is mercifully a lot simpler, a lot more intuitive, and there's no need to create anything like a locator or a group. If you can create a constraint, you animate the constraint, and Unreal will do its best, regardless of where you turn it off, to counter that. A constraint, when you set it, it goes into a list, and so you can see anything you've constrained. The constraints are always on the child object, and in Unreal, you select the child and then the parent. And if you select another constraint, say you want to pass the ball from one hand to the other, if you key that new constraint on, it's going to automatically key off the old constraint. It makes things much simpler. It's a lot less head math to do. And if you move the original constrained position of the hand or whatever, you can use a compensate keys that will allow Unreal to try and figure out the math for you and compensate things so you don't have any pops, or at least a lot less of them. This is one of those things where it makes it much easier to visualize when you can actually see your constraints appearing and disappearing. It's even, as you can see, visualized differently on the timeline. And really, it makes me want to use constraints more and try more complicated animations and setups, because it's just one less thing to think about. And while Maya does have some scripts and stuff that I've tried that try and make something more equivalent, I feel like they always have some kind of issue or caveat, or they don't work in production well for this or that. And so I'm really thankful for how this is in Unreal, and it's something that, if of all the things that Unreal does, you will like this better than Maya, most likely. All the constraint types are there. You don't have pole vector, but don't worry, you can still do IK. It's just handled a little differently. And they put them in a different order because, sure. Thankfully, Unreal also does let you mix and match. So like if you constraint something with, the translate and then the rotate separately, it'll move, but then they'll rotate from their own pivots. So all the fun little tricks we get from being able to mix and match in Maya, all there in Unreal. Space switching is one of those things that you might have it built into a rig in Maya, but Unreal just has this global tool for it. And basically how it works is uh, by default, you can switch between, the parent or the world on a control. So like with the head here, I've got it, switch to world. So then it just essentially disconnects from the body, which can be handy. Um, but also I could set something like, the hand to the head or the hands to the hips and, have them move with it without needing to create a constraint or anything like that. Again, nothing straight equivalent as a overall tool in Maya, but it's handy in situations uh, in Unreal for sure. Animation layers, super powerful tool. Use them constantly in Maya. Next to constraints, it's probably the one other tool I would not be able to live without. Unreal has the same feature set with the option to add a new section, they call it. You just click that plus button on your control rig, and it gives you what looks like in Sequencer an entirely fresh rig to work with. This new rig appears right below your old one. The keys of the original are still there on the original rig, and the new one has no keys. And while Maya gives the option to set either override or additive mode, Unreal has the same thing. They just call it absolute and additive. If you're comfortable working with animation layers in Maya, you're going to do just fine here. They work really well. And I've actually, even though it's just a visualized difference, I actually kind of like how it gives you that fresh rig to work with. All right, I'm just going to go through a few bonus tips here before we wrap up. First off is if you have gotten into control rig and the first thing you went to do was drag to select a bunch of controls and it just moved your camera, fear not, there is drag select. You just have to hold Control Alt. One of those things that drove me nuts until I realized that it wasn't a missing feature, just a missing hotkey. This one, it may seem silly, and I know the tooltips are really helpful when you're starting out, but and the graph editor, they drive me bonkers because there's a lot of information on them and they cover up half your graph. All you have to do is go into the console command, hit slate.enable tooltips equals 0, and they will go away. Much cleaner, much easier. Highly recommend doing this if you can live without the tooltips. Also, just hiding your controls. Quick hotkey. I love the last few versions of Maya, how they just added in, the Alt 2, I think it is, to hide your controls. You can just select control, hit T, you can toggle those on and off. There's a checkbox in the Anim Tools sidebar in Unreal to do it, but it's always nice to be able to just do it quickly. And last but not least, this fun little tool in the graph editor. It basically lets you save your channels as a buffer and then tweak to your heart's content. And if you don't like it, you can reload that buffer and send the curves right back to where you started without having to hit undo 500 times. It's one of those things where I didn't know I needed it, but once you get used to it, it's super, makes it nice to be able to make all those tweaks with a certain amount of confidence that you're not going to hit undo so many times that you crash it. And that covers the major tools and workflows that I find I've run into while animating, and hopefully gives you at least somewhat of an idea of whether or not Unreal is something that you could handle. Hopefully the answer is yes, because it really is a powerful tool, and I think you'll be surprised how much fun it is animating with the control rigs and with the possibilities that being in the environment gives you. At the end of the day, Unreal's gotten to the point where it may not be a perfect parody of Maya, but it's good enough and better in a few ways. There's nothing missing in Unreal that I can look at and say would seriously hinder me from animating anything that I want to, especially not since they added constraints. That was kind of the last nail in the coffin for me. Learning a new piece of software is always a bit intimidating. Animation is really hard. It takes a long time to get comfortable with new set of tools. And thankfully, I feel like Epic has made that transition from Maya to Unreal as short a distance as they possibly can. And I can't help but feel that animating directly in engines is at the very least going to be a major part of the future for animators, with so many things, even even now in film, moving to real-time engines. I remember years ago when talking to people about using Unreal Engine 4 for rendering stuff, I was, touting the speed, and they're like, "Well, I mean, you couldn't make Star Wars in here." And my answer was always, "Well, were you going to make Star Wars? Was that in your budget?" But now, ironically, yes, you apparently can make Star Wars in there with stuff like The Mandalorian. And I think as far back as Rogue One, they had a few shots of K2SO. So things have come a long way. And I think the future of being able to animate in real time with views like this, although they don't have to be dabbing, is really exciting. Even if you're not ready to jump in with both feet, it's well worth just, grabbing a free rig, firing up the engine, and getting at least familiar as possible. And who knows, you might just enjoy yourself. And that is it for me.